Believe it or not, this isn't a made-up story. On my 29th birthday, my billionaire grandfather, the man I only saw a couple of times a year, smiled at me and asked if I liked the house. I almost choked on my wine because I didn't have a house. That was the moment everything started to fall apart, revealing the betrayal that turned my life upside down. My name is Emily. I'm 29 years old and I work as a marketing specialist at a small agency in Denver. My life was as ordinary as it gets. I shared a tiny one-bedroom apartment with my roommate Rachel, counted every dollar, and took pride in making my own way. My parents, John and Linda, live very differently in a big 4-bedroom house in the suburbs, with a pool and new cars in the garage. I thought they just earned well. My dad was a department head at a major financial company, and my mom sold luxury real estate. Everything looked perfect until the questions began. For years, I lived my life not knowing there was something dark behind that picture of family success. I worked overtime to pay off my student loans, and nearly $60,000 hanging over me like a heavy weight. My parents never offered help. Instead, they told me that hardships build character. When I finally graduated, their gift was a book about financial independence, with a lecture that I had to earn everything myself. I didn't argue. I liked proving that I could handle things. But sometimes, when I was barely scraping by and they bragged about their renovations or vacations to Bali, I couldn't help but wonder, why were they so indifferent to my struggles? My grandfather Robert was a legend in our family. He had built a construction empire from scratch, starting with a tiny firm in Colorado, and now owns skyscrapers across the West. He was strict, even intimidating, and rarely showed up at family gatherings. But whenever we did meet, he always asked about my work, my ideas in marketing, and he listened like it truly mattered. I felt he saw something in me even if we didn't talk often. My cousin Michael, Linda's sister's son, was the complete opposite. He lived large, trendy restaurants, designer clothes, European vacations. I thought maybe he had just made smart investments or got a generous boost from family. At dinners, he bragged about his purchases, and I always found it strange, since I could barely afford a new laptop for work. The week before my birthday was pure chaos. My company lost a major client, and they told me my contract might not be renewed. I had savings for maybe 1 more month of rent, and I was panicking about how I'd pay the bills. When my parents called to say they wanted to celebrate my birthday at a fancy restaurant downtown, I tried to refuse. "Let's just order pizza at my place. I really can't afford something like that," I told them, embarrassed that their expensive plans clashed with my empty wallet. But they insisted, saying they'd cover everything and I shouldn't worry. Now I realize their insistence was nothing but guilt trying to disguise itself. There were little things I hadn't noticed back then, like the time my dad snapped when I mentioned signing up for online marketing courses, telling me I had too much debt already, or how my mom always changed the subject if I complained about money. Sometimes I overheard their hushed phone calls that went silent as soon as I entered the room. And a couple of months earlier, I'd caught my mom quickly closing her laptop when I walked in. She had been looking at villas in Costa Rica. When I asked if they were planning a trip, she waved it off, saying it was just dreaming. Those were the first warning signs, but I was too busy trying to survive to notice. On the morning of my birthday, Rachel, my roommate and best friend, gave me a handmade card and a lavender-scented candle I had been wanting for months. She knew how hard things were for me, and her little gift felt like a warm ray of light in a grey day. While I got ready for dinner, Rachel helped me pick out a dress, nothing fancy, just the best I had. I slipped on my only decent pair of heels and added a touch of makeup, never realizing that in just a few hours my whole life would change forever. Little did I know, the real nightmare was only about to start. When I walked into the restaurant my parents had chosen, I instantly felt a knot in my stomach. It was one of those places where the waiters looked like they earned more than I did, and the menus didn't even show prices. Tables were dressed in white linen, crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead, and the air carried a mix of expensive perfume and roasted lobster. Mom had already ordered a bottle of champagne before I arrived, and it sat on ice like we were celebrating a wedding, not just my birthday. Sitting there in my simple blue dress and worn-down heels, I felt completely out of place. My mom, Linda, wore an elegant black dress with a diamond necklace that probably cost more than my yearly rent. My dad, John, had on a dark suit with shiny cufflinks that flashed every time he lifted his glass. I tried to smile, but inside I was shrinking with discomfort. Why would they pick a place like this, knowing I was barely scraping by? The conversation at the table felt stiff and rehearsed. They asked about my job, but whenever I brought up the fact that I might lose it, Mom quickly changed the subject to something trivial, like I knew sure they were watching. Dad launched into stories from his younger years, but his eyes kept darting around, like he was waiting for something. They gave me a leather handbag and knives, but not nearly the kind of gift that matched the extravagance of this restaurant. When I thanked them, Mom jumped in again with the same old lecture about how important it was to be financially independent and never rely on anyone else. I nodded, but inside the unease was growing. Their words felt rehearsed, their smiles too forced. Maybe I'm just tired, I thought, trying to brush off the feeling. But the truth was, I'd been noticing odd things for months. Like the time I mentioned I couldn't afford a vacation, and Mom quickly dodged the topic before bragging about their trip to Hawaii. Or when Dad casually said they were thinking of traveling more, but his voice cracked like he was hiding something. Each of those moments had seemed small at the time, but now they formed a bigger, more troubling picture. Why were they so evasive about money? And how did their lifestyle seem so extravagant while I was struggling to buy a new couch? Then the entire mood in the restaurant shifted, as if someone had turned on a spotlight. Conversations at nearby tables quieted, waiters stiffened, and I felt the air grow heavy. I turned it, and there he was. My grandfather, Robert. In his 80s, he looked like a man who could buy the entire restaurant without blinking. His dark suit was tailored so perfectly it looked like it set the standard, and his silver hair glowed under the chandeliers. Walking beside him was Sarah, his assistant, a sharp woman in her 40s with a tablet in hand and eyes that missed nothing. My parents froze. Dad nearly dropped his fork, and Mom gripped her glass so tightly I thought it might shatter. "Robert, what a surprise," Dad said, standing so quickly his chest screeched against the floor. His voice was higher than usual, and I saw his hand shaking. "We didn't expect you to come." Grandpa didn't even glance at him. Instead, he walked straight to me, and his stern face softened into a rare smile. "Happy birthday, Emily," he said, leaning down to kiss my cheek. He smelled of expensive cologne, sandalwood, and leather. 29 years. Time flies, doesn't it? "Thank you, Grandpa," I said, warmth flooding me despite the tension. "I am so glad you came." He sat down next to me, while Sarah stayed by the table's edge, tablet in hand like she was ready to record every word. "I wanted to hear how you're doing," Robert said, his gaze fixed on me like I was the only person in the room. "Sarah tells me your investment portfolio is performing well. The trust should be in good shape this year." I froze. "What portfolio? What trust?" I asked, my voice shaking as a chill ran through me. Robert frowned slightly, though his voice stayed calm. "Your trust fund, Emily, the one I created when you were born. You're 29 now, so it should be fully under your control. $5 million, plus the interest over the years." The world stopped spinning. $5 million? I looked at my parents. Dad stared at his plate, and Mom pressed her lips so tightly they turned white. "There must be some mistake," I stammered, my voice trembling. "I don't know anything about a trust fund." Robert's expression didn't change, but his eyes hardened like steel. "And you don't know about the house either?" His voice dropped lower, which only made it scarier. "The one I bought for you 2 years ago, on your 27th birthday in Cherry Creek with a view of the mountains. Do you like living there? My head spun. What house? I whispered. The silence at the table was crushing. Dad's face drained of color, and Mom stared into nothing, nervously twisting the edge of the tablecloth. Robert slowly turned to them, his voice icy cold. Then where's the money, John? Where's the house? Dad tried to speak, but his voice cracked. Robert, this is a misunderstanding. We can explain, he muttered, but his words were empty. I sincerely hope so, Robert said, his tone razor sharp. He glanced at Sarah. Call David, tell him to come here immediately. Already done, Sarah replied, tapping her tablet. He'll be here in 15 minutes, and I've asked the office to prepare all the financial records for the trust. Whispers rippled through the other tables. Waiters stood frozen, unsure if they should approach. Mom reached across the table to take my hand, but I pulled away, fury and hurt rising in my chest. Emily, sweetheart, it's not what you think, she pleaded, her voice trembling. Then what is it? I snapped, unable to hold back. You've been hiding millions of dollars from me, a house that was supposed to be mine, while I lived in a shoebox apartment and counted every penny? Dad coughed, trying to steady himself. Emily, this is a family matter. Let's discuss it at home. No, Robert cut in, his voice sharp as a whip. We'll settle this right here. He turned back to me, his gaze softening just slightly. Emily, you deserve the truth, and I'll make sure you get it. But this was only the beginning of what was about to unfold. Sarah quickly spoke with the restaurant manager, and we were escorted into a private room in a dim space with a long table that looked like it hosted presidential meetings. There were 4 of us seated, me, Grandpa Robert, my father John, and my mother Linda. Sarah stood by the door, her fingers flying across her tablet. The air was so thick with tension it felt hard to breathe. My parents looked like they wanted to sink into the floor. Dad fidgeted with his cufflinks, while Mom nervously twisted the ring on her finger. I just sat there staring at them, a storm of shock, anger, and numbness swirling inside me. How could the people who raised me hide millions of dollars and a house from me? Robert sat at the head of the table, his posture straight like a general before battle. Explain yourselves, he said quietly, but the force in his voice sent shivers down my spine. Dad mumbled something about complicated investments and temporary setbacks, but his words rang hollow, like even he didn't believe them. Mom stayed silent, staring down at the tablecloth, her face pale as paper. I couldn't hold back any longer. You knew I was working extra shifts just to pay bills, I said, my voice trembling with fury. You watched me scrimp on groceries so I wouldn't default on my loans, and all this time there was a trust fund, a house. Before they could answer, the door opened and David walked in, Robert's attorney. He was a short man with thinning hair and sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. In his hands was a leather folder, which he carefully laid on the table. I brought the trust documents, he said, looking at Robert, and the most recent financial reports. Robert nodded, not taking his eyes off my parents. Tell Emily everything, he ordered. David opened the folder and began speaking, his calm voice hitting like a hammer with every word. When you were born, Robert created a trust fund for you with $5 million. The conditions were simple. Your parents, John and Linda, would manage it until your 27th birthday, after which control would pass fully to you. The money could only be used for your education, health, or well-being, and every expense had to be documented. He paused, looking directly at me. From your reaction, I take it no one ever told you about this. I shook my head, my throat tight. No one ever said a word, I whispered, glaring at my parents. They still wouldn't meet my eyes. David continued. According to the latest reports, the trust should now hold about $7 million with interest, but there's a problem. He pulled out another stack of papers. Over the past 7 years, there have been numerous unauthorized withdrawals. Large sums were transferred into John and Linda's personal accounts. He turned his gaze on my parents. As of now, less than $300,000 remain in the trust. The floor seemed to vanish under me. $7 million reduced to less than $300,000. I looked at my parents, waiting for them to claim it was a mistake. But Dad only hung his head, and Mom covered her face with her hands. "Where is the money?" Robert demanded, his voice sharp as steel. Dad finally spoke, his voice trembling. We took a little here and there to cover expenses, the mortgage, cars, Linda's business. We thought we'd pay it back before Emily ever found out. Mom added in a whisper, "We didn't want you growing up spoiled. We thought it was for your own good, therefore my own good." I snapped, my eyes burning with tears. "You watched me eat ramen just to make rent, while you bought a second home in Aspen, while I shared an apartment with Rachel. You were renting out my house for profit." Robert raised a hand to calm me. "David, what about the Cherry Creek house?" he asked. David flipped through the documents. "It was purchased 2 years ago using the trust, a 2-story home with mountain views, but it's registered under John and Linda's names. They've been collecting $5,000 a month in rent." My chest tightened. They hadn't just stolen my money, they'd been making money off the house that should have been mine. Robert turned to my parents, his voice thunderous. "Do you understand this is theft, and not just theft, a betrayal of your own daughter?" Dad tried to protest. "We were going to put it back, it was temporary." But his words sounded desperate, and I could see even he didn't believe them. Then Mom looked up, tears in her eyes, and her tone shifted into something darker. "Emily, if you take us to court, you'll destroy this family. We can fix this, but remember, we have proof you weren't always honest either." I froze. "What are you talking about?" I asked, my heart pounding. Mom leaned closer, her voice low. "We know about your credit card debt, about how you spent money on parties back in college. If you start this fight, we'll tell Robert everything. Do you really want him to think you're responsible?" I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Were they blackmailing me? Using my debts I took on just to survive as leverage? Anger surged through me, but before I could respond, Robert spoke. "Enough," he said, his voice booming like thunder. "Sarah, call the police, financial crimes, and freeze all of their assets. Nothing moves without my approval." Sarah nodded and began dialing. Dad jumped to his feet. "Robert, please, don't. We'll find a way to pay it back." Mom sobbed, her voice trembling. "Emily, please, don't let him do this. We're your parents." I stared at them, the people who had raised me, taught me to tie my shoes, cheered at my school awards. And all I felt was pain, like a part of my heart had been ripped out. But I knew I couldn't let them manipulate me anymore. "You stole my future," I said quietly but firmly. "I want the whole truth, and I want you held accountable." Robert placed a hand on my shoulder. "Emily, this is your decision. Do you want the police to handle it, or should we try another way?" I took a deep breath, gathering myself. "I don't want you to end up in prison," I told my parents. "But I want everything returned, and I want the truth for all of it." Robert nodded. "David, start with a full audit of their finances and make sure the Cherry Creek house is transferred into Emily's name." He looked at my parents, his eyes cold. "You will cooperate, or the consequences will be far worse." Dad's face went gray as he nodded. Mom just kept crying, saying nothing. I sat there staring at them, feeling something inside me break. These were my parents, but I no longer knew who they truly were. And what would you have done in my place? Would you forgive them or demand full justice? The nightmare was far from over. The most painful revelations were still waiting for me when we left the restaurant. The Denver air felt colder than usual for early fall. I turned down Robert's offer to drive me home. I needed time alone to process everything. In the back of a taxi, city lights flickering past the window, I stared at my hands, still shaking. My parents, John and Linda, had stolen millions of dollars from me, along with a house that should have been mine. Their attempt to blackmail me kept replaying in my head like a broken record. "We'll tell Robert you're irresponsible." It felt like the foundation of my entire life had been ripped away. Everything I thought I knew about my family was a lie. When I got back to my tiny apartment, Rachel, my roommate and best friend, immediately knew something was wrong. She quietly sat me on our worn-out couch, wrapped a blanket around me, and handed me a mug of tea. "Emily, what happened?" she asked, her voice full of concern. I told her everything: the trust fund, the Cherry Creek house, the way my parents had been living off my money while I was fighting for every cent. By the end of it, I couldn't hold back my tears. I was eating instant noodles to save on rent. "Rachel," I said, choking on anger and pain. "And all that time, they were renting out my house and buying a yacht." Rachel squeezed my hand. "That's not just betrayal, Emily. I don't even know what to call it, but you're not alone. We'll figure this out." Her words felt like a lifeline in a storm, and I clung to them even as rage still boiled inside me. The next morning, Robert's assistant, Sarah, called with updates. "We've frozen all your parents' accounts," she said briskly. "David and his team are already conducting an audit. They found payments for the Aspen house, 2 cars, a yacht, and even transfers to offshore accounts. It looks like they were planning to leave the country." My blood ran cold. "Leave the country?" I asked. "Yes," Sarah confirmed. "We found airline tickets to Costa Rica, purchased last week. They were planning to fly out 2 days after your birthday." I sat at my kitchen table clutching the phone, realizing my parents not only stole from me, but also intended to vanish and leave me in the wreckage. Robert insisted I come to his downtown office, where his legal team was already working. When I entered his office, huge, with panoramic windows overlooking the Rocky Mountains, he looked both tired and determined. "Emily, I should have checked sooner," he said, his voice softer than usual. "I trusted them, but now we'll fix this." David, the attorney, spread out stacks of documents in front of us. "We traced most of the funds," he said. "About $3 million went into the Aspen property and the yacht. Another $2 million were lost in lenders' failed real estate investments. The rest was spent on things like cars, jewelry, vacations, but there's more." He paused, glancing at Robert. "Some money was transferred into an account under your cousin Michael's name." I felt my breath catch. "Michael?" My cousin, who always flaunted his luxurious lifestyle, was involved too. Robert scowled. "How much?" "Roughly $500,000 over the last 3 years, David replied. "It looks like he knew about the trust and helped John and Linda hide transfers." Memories of Michael boasting at family dinners, designer suits, stories about Paris and Dubai suddenly made sense. He hadn't earned it. He had stolen it. "I want to talk to him," I said, anger surging. Robert nodded. "Sarah, track him down. He'll explain himself." But then things took an even darker turn. 2 days after that dinner, I received a strange text from an unknown number. "If you don't want Robert to know the truth about your finances, drop your claims to the trust." I showed it to Sarah, who immediately forwarded it to the police. "This is blackmail," she said. "And judging by the timing, your parents aren't done yet." The following evening, I was walking home from a meeting with the lawyers. It was dark, and the street was quiet, when a black SUV with tinted windows started following me. My heart pounded. I quickened my pace. The car stopped, and 2 men in dark jackets got out. "Emily, don't scream," one of them said in a low, threatening voice. "Get in the car, and nobody gets hurt." Panic surged through me, but I managed to press the emergency button on my phone, the one Sarah had insisted I install after the dinner. Within minutes, sirens wailed in the distance. The men bolted back into the SUV, which sped away. Police arrived 5 minutes later, and I, still shaking, told them everything. The detective, an older man with tired eyes, listened carefully. "We'll check the vehicle," he said. "But this looks staged. Someone wanted to scare you." When I told Robert, he was furious. This was their doing, he snapped, meaning my parents. They are trying to break you. By evening, Sarah had confirmation. The SUV had been rented under a shell company tied to Linda's business. My parents had staged the kidnapping attempt to pressure me into dropping my claims. Their last desperate move to keep control. But it failed. The police uncovered records linking the rental to accounts funded with trust money. And then another detail emerged. Michael hadn't just taken money, he had helped forge documents to cover the transfers. When Sarah and David summoned him for a meeting, he showed up looking less like a flashy socialite and more like a cornered animal. I didn't know they'd take everything, he muttered, avoiding my eyes. They told me it was temporary, that you weren't ready for that kind of money. I glared at him, fury boiling inside me. You knew, Michael, you saw how I was living, and you still took my money. He didn't answer, just stared at the floor. Robert's look of disgust was so sharp it felt like the room grew colder. You'll pay for this, he said. Just like they will. By the end of the week, the police and David's team had gathered enough evidence to begin recovering assets. The Cherry Creek house was transferred into my name, and I learned it was worth nearly $2 million. But money and property couldn't numb the pain of betrayal. Sitting in Robert's office, staring at the mountains outside the window, tears ran down my cheeks. Why did they do this to me? I asked, not expecting an answer. Robert sighed, his expression softening. Sometimes people lose themselves chasing what they don't have, he said. But you're stronger than they are, and you'll prove it. Little did I know, the real nightmare was only beginning. A year had passed since the birthday that turned my life upside down. I was sitting in my new home in Cherry Creek, spacious, with large windows looking out onto the snow-capped Rocky Mountains. The furniture wasn't all there yet, but I was slowly making it mine, a cozy couch I picked myself, a few plants from Rachel, and some of my old paintings finally hanging on the walls. Sometimes I just stand by the window with a cup of coffee, trying to process that this house truly belonged to me. But even with the keys in my hand, there was still an emptiness where my family used to be. The betrayal by my parents, John and Linda, and my cousin Michael had left scars I knew would never fully heal. After their staged kidnapping plot failed, everything moved quickly. David, my grandfather Robert's attorney, and his team conducted a full audit. They recovered almost $4 million of the stolen money, including the yacht sale and the Aspen property. The rest, sadly, was gone wasted on Linda's failed investments and reckless spending. The Cherry Creek house was officially transferred into my name, and I moved in 3 months after that infamous dinner. Even the rent money my parents had collected for my house was returned, about $120,000 for 2 years. That helped me pay off my student loans and finally start a new chapter debt-free. My parents avoided prison, but not consequences. Robert insisted they cooperate with attorneys, and they returned everything they could. Their reputation was ruined. People who once envied their glamorous lifestyle now whispered about their downfall. They sold their suburban home and moved into a small apartment just to cover legal costs. I tried speaking with them a few times, but every conversation ended in excuses or tears. We only wanted to protect you, Mom kept saying, but I couldn't believe it anymore. In the end, I set firm boundaries. Communication went through lawyers until I was ready for more. Maybe someday I'll forgive them, but for now, the wound is still raw. Michael, my cousin, ended up even worse off. It turned out he hadn't just taken money from my trustee, he had also helped my parents forge documents to cover the transfers. Robert cut him out of the family business entirely and barred him from accessing any family funds. The last time I saw him, he tried to apologize, but his words felt hollow. I didn't think it would go this far, he said, eyes on the floor. I just shook my head and walked away. He had been part of breaking my trust, and I wasn't ready to forgive him. But life didn't stop. With Robert's help, I learned how to manage the remaining trust assets. He spent hours teaching me about investments, budgeting, and how not to repeat my parents' mistakes. Money is a tool, Emily, he told me firmly but kindly. Never let it control you. Those lessons became my anchor, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I had real control over my future. I found a new job as a marketing manager at a major Denver company, thanks to Claire, a former colleague who recommended me. The salary was double what I made before, and I was finally working on projects that inspired me. I even started a small side business consulting local startups on digital marketing. It was scary, but each new client reminded me I was capable of more than I had believed. Rachel, my best friend, remained my rock. She came to my new house with a bottle of wine, making me laugh even on the hardest days. One evening, while we sat on my balcony watching the sun set over the mountains, she said, "Emily, you've been through hell, but look at you now, you made it." I smiled, letting the warmth of her words chase away the cold inside me. And then there was David, Robert's attorney. After all the meetings and documents, he became more than just a lawyer. We started grabbing coffee, talking not only about the case but about books, movies, life. He had a calm presence and a dry sense of humor, and his steady confidence grounded me. When he finally asked me out to dinner, a real one, not work-related, I felt butterflies in my stomach for the first time in years. It wasn't just a date. It was proof that I could trust again. Robert and I also grew closer than ever. We had Sunday dinners together, where he shared stories of building his empire from scratch. He even enrolled me in financial literacy courses, paying for them himself. "You're the future of this family, Emily," he told me one night, and tears welled up in my eyes. For the first time, I realized I had someone who believed in me unconditionally. I also started a mentorship program for young marketers from underprivileged backgrounds. I wanted to give others the kind of support I never had when I was starting out. Every time I saw one of my mentees land their first job or launch a project, I felt like I was giving back some of the good the world had finally given me. A year ago, I was sitting in a restaurant, completely unaware that my life was about to collapse. My parents' betrayal, Michael's involvement, all the lies, it cut deep, like a knife to the heart. But that pain forced me to rebuild everything. I realized the most valuable things aren't money or houses, but trust, honesty, and the people who stand by you even when everything falls apart. I built a new life on truth, and despite it all, I'm grateful for that. So tell me, what would you do if you found out your family had hidden millions from you? Would you forgive them or fight for justice, no matter the cost? That's the end of today's story. Thank you for staying with me until the very last twist. I truly want to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below. I read every single one. If you want more shocking true stories like this, check out the playlist in the description. And don't miss the next one. Hit subscribe and tap the bell so YouTube will always bring you the newest stories first. Thank you for listening, and remember, even the darkest betrayals can end with freedom, dignity, and your own voice being heard.